close your eyes. Let the sounds of your world fade into a soft, distant hum. Tonight, we are not traveling forward into the unknown depths of space. Instead, we are journeying back in time to a question that hangs in the night sky alongside the moon itself. Why did we stop going? After the triumphant footsteps of 12 astronauts on that pale, dusty surface, after planting a flag in the silent sea of tranquility, humanity turned its back on the moon. It seems almost unthinkable, a grand adventure cut short. The common answer you hear is simple. Money. It was too expensive. But the truth, as is often the case, is a far more complex and fascinating tapestry, woven from threads of politics, waning wonder, and a quiet shift in our collective dream for the future. Tonight, we will unravel that tapestry, thread by thread. We will explore the real reasons we left our celestial neighbor, and in doing so, perhaps understand a little more about ourselves. So, breathe in deeply, and let's begin our journey back to the end of the Apollo era. Before we delve into the reasons for the end, we must first feel the beginning. Picture the world in the mid-20th century, a planet divided, caught in the silent, tense grip of the Cold War. Two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, vied for dominance not with armies on a battlefield, but with ideology, influence, and technological prowess. The sky was no longer the limit. It was the new frontier, the ultimate high ground. When the Soviet Union launched Sputnik in 1957, a tiny, beeping sphere orbiting the Earth, it sent a shockwave of awe and fear across America. The space race had begun. It was not a race for science, not at its heart. It was a race for prestige, a demonstration of power, a political statement broadcast to the entire world. President John F. Kennedy, in his famous speech in 1962, did not promise the moon because it was easy. He promised it because it was hard. Because that goal would serve to organize and measure the best of American energies and skills. The Apollo program was born from this challenge. It was a monumental undertaking, a national obsession, a crusade with a single shining goal: to land a man on the moon and return him safely to the Earth before the decade was out. And on July 20th, 1969, they did it. The world held its breath as Neil Armstrong took that one small step. It was a victory. But a victory in what exactly? In winning the race. And with the finish line crossed, the fundamental reason for running so hard, so fast, and at such great expense began to quietly dissolve. Let's first drift into the sheer magnitude of the achievement to understand what was being left behind. Imagine the silence, not the quiet of a peaceful night, but a perfect, profound emptiness that exists only in the vacuum of space. This was the world of the Apollo astronauts. Inside their cramped capsule, the hum of machinery was a constant companion. But outside, there was nothing, just the slow, silent dance of celestial bodies. Picture the Earth as they saw it, a vibrant, swirling marble of blue and white, suspended in an infinite blackness. A world of oceans, clouds, and continents, all of humanity's history and hopes, contained in that one beautiful sphere. It was a perspective that changed them forever, an experience known as the overview effect, a feeling of profound connection to the planet, a sense of the fragility of our existence. The journey itself was a marvel of precision, a cosmic ballet choreographed by thousands of minds back on Earth. Every calculation, every burn of the engine, every maneuver had to be perfect. They were traveling faster than any humans had ever traveled, hurled through the void by controlled explosions, aiming for a moving target 250,000 miles away. Think of the delicate lunar module, the Eagle or the Antares, a fragile-looking craft of metal foil and wire, descending toward the cratered surface. It was the first true spacecraft, designed to fly only in the absence of air, its spindly legs reaching down to touch a world that had, until then, existed only in dreams and poetry. This was not just a technological feat. It was the culmination of a dream as old as consciousness itself. The dream of touching the sky, of reaching out to that silver light that governs our tides and illuminates our nights. For a brief, shining moment in history, that dream was real. The feeling was electric, a sense of unity and shared triumph that crossed all borders. For a short time, we were not Americans or Russians. We were Earthlings, and our people were walking on the moon. This was the peak, the absolute zenith of a national effort that had consumed the better part of a decade. It was glorious, and it felt like it could be the beginning of a new age of exploration. No one at that moment, watching the grainy black and white images on their televisions, could imagine that in just 3 short years, it would all be over. Now, let's gently turn our attention to the foundation upon which this grand cathedral of exploration was built. It was a foundation made not of stone or steel, but of money, an astronomical amount of it. To truly grasp the cost of the Apollo program, we must let our minds float away from simple numbers and into the realm of scale and comparison. The final cost, in today's money, is estimated to be over $280 billion. It is a number so large it becomes abstract, almost meaningless. So let's try to visualize it. Imagine a stack of $1 bills. That $280 billion would create a stack reaching over 19,000 miles high, a fragile paper tower stretching nearly 1/10 of the way to the moon itself. During its peak years in the mid-1960s, the Apollo program consumed over 4% of the entire United States federal budget. Think of everything a government does. Builds roads into schools, funds science and healthcare, maintains a military. For every $100 the government spent, more than 4 of them were going directly to NASA. And the vast majority of that was for the moonshot. This financial gravity was immense. It pulled resources, talent, and attention from every other sector of society. It was the equivalent of fighting a major war, but this war was against the laws of physics and the vastness of space. The Saturn V rocket, the colossal vehicle that propelled the astronauts into history, was the most powerful machine ever built by humans. Each launch cost, in today's terms, nearly $2 billion. That is just the launch. It does not include the decade of research, the construction of the vehicle, the sprawling launch facilities at Cape Canaveral, or the global network of tracking stations. It does not include the salaries of the 400,000 people who worked on the project. From the brilliant engineers in Houston's mission control to the seamstresses who hand-stitched the spacesuits in Delaware. This was a project of unprecedented national mobilization. While the goal was noble and the achievement historic, a quiet question began to form in the minds of many Americans. With so many pressing issues at home, poverty, civil rights, the escalating war in Vietnam, was this the best use of such a vast treasure? The race to the moon was a sprint, an all-out exertion of financial and human capital. And like any sprint, it could not be sustained forever. The economic reality was a silent, powerful force, pulling the dream of lunar colonization back down to Earth long before the final splashdown. Let the image of that glowing television screen return to your mind. The grainy, black and white footage of Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin. The entire world was watching, captivated. It was a singular moment of shared human experience. But what happens after the climax of the story? The public's fascination, once a blazing fire, began to cool into embers. With Apollo 11, America had won the race. The primary geopolitical objective was complete. The Soviet Union had been soundly and publicly defeated in the quest for the moon. For many, the story was over. The subsequent missions, while scientifically valuable, lacked the dramatic punch of the first landing. Apollo 12 went to the moon just 4 months later, yet it barely registered on the public consciousness. A major television network even cut away from live footage of the moonwalk to show a soap opera. The novelty had worn off. It was becoming routine. Think of it like watching a suspenseful movie. The first time, you are on the edge of your seat. The second time, you know the ending. By the third or fourth viewing, you might just have it on in the background. The public sentiment began to shift from "we're going to the moon" to "we're going to the moon." Again? This was happening against a backdrop of immense turmoil on Earth. The late 60s and early 70s were a time of profound social change and conflict in the United States. The Vietnam War was raging, costing lives and treasure, and dividing the nation. The civil rights movement was fighting for justice and equality. Cities were grappling with poverty and unrest. In this context, the sight of astronauts bouncing on a distant, lifeless world began to feel disconnected, out of touch. An expensive distraction from the real problems people were facing every day. Protest songs were written about the disparity. Gil Scott-Heron's famous poem, Whitey on the Moon, captured this sentiment perfectly. A rat done bit my sister Nell, with Whitey on the moon. Her face and arms began to swell, and Whitey's on the moon. The public's gaze, once lifted to the heavens, was now turning inward, focusing on the deep-seated issues of their own society. The political will to fund such an expensive program relies heavily on public support. And when the people stopped looking up, the politicians stopped signing the checks. The wonder had faded, replaced by a weary pragmatism. The greatest adventure in history was losing its audience. Now let us consider the scientific heart of the matter. The Apollo missions were not just a political spectacle. They were the most ambitious scientific expeditions in history. With each landing, we learned more about our celestial companion. The astronauts were not just explorers. They were field geologists, conducting experiments, drilling core samples and collecting rocks. They brought back a total of 842 pounds of lunar material. These rocks were a time capsule from the early days of our solar system. They told a story of a violent birth, of the moon being formed from the debris of a massive collision between a young Earth and a Mars-sized protoplanet. They revealed that the moon was not a pristine, unchanging body, but a geologically complex world with a history of volcanic activity. The samples helped us calibrate the timeline of the solar system, showing us that a period of intense asteroid bombardment, the late, heavy bombardment, reshaped the inner planets billions of years ago. The experiments left on the surface, like the laser retroreflectors, are still used today to measure the exact distance to the moon, confirming that it is slowly drifting away from Earth at a rate of about 1.5 inches per year. All of this knowledge was revolutionary. It fundamentally changed our understanding of Earth's own history and the formation of our planetary system. However, from a certain scientific perspective, the returns began to diminish with each mission. The first few landings provided a treasure trove of groundbreaking data, but by Apollo 15, 16, and 17, the new discoveries, while important, were becoming more incremental. The big questions like, where did the moon come from? And what is it made of? Had been answered in broad strokes. The scientists had their foundational data. Many in the scientific community began to argue that the immense cost of sending humans was no longer justified for the kind of science they now wanted to do. Robotic probes, they contended, could gather vast amounts of data at a fraction of the cost. Probes could be sent to other, more mysterious worlds, like Mars, Jupiter, or Saturn. They could stay for years, not just a few days. The argument shifted from exploration to efficiency. Why spend billions to send 2 people to one spot on the moon for 3 days when you could send a fleet of advanced robots to explore the entire solar system for decades? The scientific community, once a primary driver of the Apollo program, began to look beyond the moon toward new, unanswered questions in more distant and exotic corners of the cosmos. The moon, once the ultimate destination, was becoming a familiar shore from which they yearned to set sail for deeper oceans. Let your mind drift now into the quiet, wood-paneled offices of Washington, D.C. in the early 1970s. Here, away from the roar of rockets and the silent expanse of space, the final act of the Apollo story was written. The key figure in this chapter was President Richard Nixon. Unlike Kennedy, Nixon had no deep, emotional connection to the space program. He inherited it. For him, it was not a grand crusade, but a line item on a federal budget, and a very large one at that. He saw the program through the cold, pragmatic lens of a politician. The primary goal, beating the Russians, was achieved. The public was losing interest. The costs were becoming a political liability. There was immense pressure to redirect funding toward domestic programs and the Vietnam War. In 1970, Nixon faced a critical decision. NASA presented him with a bold, ambitious plan for the future. It was a vision straight out of science fiction. A permanent space station in Earth orbit, a reusable space shuttle to service it, and from there, a new program of lunar exploration, leading to a permanent moon base, and ultimately, a manned mission to Mars. It was a spectacular, multi-decade plan for the systematic colonization of the solar system. The price tag, however, was equally spectacular. It was far too expensive for a nation growing tired of cosmic adventures and grappling with problems on the ground. Nixon had to choose. He couldn't fund everything, and he couldn't simply cancel the entire manned space program without appearing to surrender America's leadership in space. So he made a compromise. He rejected the moon base and the Mars mission. They were deemed too expensive and too far in the future. Instead, he approved two of the more practical components of the plan: the space shuttle and the Skylab space station. The logic was clear. The space shuttle was pitched as a reusable space truck, promising routine, affordable access to low Earth orbit. The Skylab station, built from a modified third stage of a Saturn V rocket, would be America's first laboratory in space, a place to study the long-term effects of weightlessness on the human body and conduct experiments. The focus was shifting away from flags and footprints exploration. The new vision was utilitarian. It was about creating a permanent human presence and an industrial capability in the space right above our heads. This political pivot was the final nail in the coffin for Apollo. 3 planned missions, Apollo 18, 19, and 20, were unceremoniously canceled. The massive Saturn V rockets that would have carried them were turned into museum pieces. The era of lunar exploration was over, not with a bang, but with a budget meeting and a political calculation. The dream of Camelot had given way to the pragmatism of the 70s. Imagine now a slow, graceful transition. The gaze of NASA, and indeed the world, began to shift from the distant, silvery orb of the moon to the vibrant blue horizon of our own planet. A new dream was being forged, one of practicality and permanence. This was the dawn of the space shuttle era. Picture this new vehicle. It was not a capsule and a towering, disposable rocket. It was something entirely different. A winged space plane, a hybrid of rocket and aircraft. It would launch like a rocket, maneuver in orbit like a spacecraft, and land on a runway like a glider. It was designed to be the workhorse of the heavens, a reusable link to low Earth orbit. The promise was alluring: routine, economical access to space. It was meant to make space flight seem almost commonplace. The shuttle would carry satellites into orbit for communications and science, repair existing ones, and be the construction vehicle for the future. It was a tool, not just a vessel for exploration. Its purpose was to industrialize the space around our planet. This was a fundamental change in philosophy. The Apollo program was a sprint to a destination. The shuttle program was about building a highway, a permanent infrastructure that would allow for continuous work and habitation in orbit. Alongside this, the Skylab project emerged. Think of an enormous workshop, a home in the void, orbiting the Earth every 93 minutes. Launched in 1973 on the last Saturn V rocket ever to fly, Skylab was America's first space station. For months at a time, 3 different crews of astronauts lived and worked there, floating through its cavernous interior. They were not just pilots and adventurers. They were scientists and subjects. They conducted medical experiments to understand how the human body adapts to zero gravity. They pointed telescopes at the sun, capturing unprecedented images of our star. They looked down at the Earth, studying weather patterns, natural resources, and the impact of human activity. Skylab was the prototype for the future of human spaceflight. It proved that humans could live and work productively in space for extended periods. It was the crucial first step on the path that would eventually lead to the International Space Station. So while the public saw the end of the moon landings as a retreat, NASA saw it as a strategic redeployment. They were trading the excitement of deep space exploration for the long-term, practical goal of mastering our own orbital backyard. It was a less romantic vision, perhaps, but one they believed would lay a more sustainable foundation for the future of humanity in space. The journey to the moon was over, but the journey to living in space was just beginning. Let's take a moment to drift back to the Apollo program itself and acknowledge a quiet, powerful force that contributed to its end: risk. The entire endeavor was balanced on a razor's edge. We often remember the successes, the triumphant landings and safe returns. But the danger was immense, a constant, silent passenger on every flight. The astronauts were acutely aware that they were strapped to the top of the most powerful and complex machine ever created, a controlled explosion that generated 160 million horsepower. Thousands of components had to work perfectly, in sequence, for them to survive. Mission Control in Houston was a room filled with brilliant minds, but they were 250,000 miles away. If something went wrong on or near the moon, there was no rescue. There was no coming home. The world saw this terrifying reality firsthand during the Apollo 13 mission. Houston, we've had a problem. Those calm, understated words masked a life or death crisis. An oxygen tank had exploded, crippling the service module, the astronauts' lifeboat. The lunar landing was aborted. The mission became a desperate struggle for survival. The world watched and prayed for 3 days as NASA engineers on the ground worked feverishly, inventing solutions on the fly, using little more than cardboard, plastic bags, and duct tape to build a makeshift carbon dioxide filter. The crew, cold and exhausted, used the lunar module as a lifeboat, swinging around the far side of the moon and slingshotting back toward Earth. Their safe return was hailed as NASA's finest hour, a testament to human ingenuity and resilience. But the incident was also a stark, terrifying reminder of the stakes. It pierced the veil of invincibility that had surrounded the program after Apollo 11. It showed the public and the politicians just how close to disaster these missions truly were. Every successful launch and landing had been a roll of the cosmic dice. How long could they keep winning? The pressure on NASA was immense. A fatal accident on the moon would have been a national trauma, a tragedy played out on a global stage. It might have ended the program on the spot, under a cloud of failure and grief. As the missions continued, some began to feel they were pushing their luck. Canceling the final missions, while disappointing to the astronauts and engineers, was also, in a way, a decision to quit while they were ahead, to preserve the perfect, triumphant legacy of the program. The inherent, life-threatening danger of strapping humans to rockets and sending them to another world was a powerful, unspoken argument for bringing the Apollo era to a dignified and safe conclusion. Let's consider another subtle yet powerful factor in the winding down of the Apollo era: the human element, specifically the astronauts themselves. These individuals were presented to the world as superhuman figures, pilots and engineers with the right stuff. They were heroes in the classical sense, venturing into the unknown for the sake of their nation and all humanity. But after the race was won, the nature of their role began to change. On the early missions, they were primarily test pilots and explorers. Their job was to fly the spacecraft, land it, and prove that it could be done. By the later J missions, Apollo 15, 16, and 17, the focus had shifted dramatically to science. The astronauts were expected to be expert field geologists. They underwent hundreds of hours of geology training, learning to identify rock formations, analyze strata, and make informed decisions about which samples to collect. They were equipped with the lunar roving vehicle, the moon buggy, which allowed them to travel miles from their landing site and conduct extensive geological surveys. Men like Harrison Jack Schmidt, a professional geologist and the only scientist to walk on the moon on Apollo 17, represented this new phase. For them, the moon was not just a destination, it was a complex and fascinating scientific puzzle to be unlocked. However, this shift created a certain disconnect. The public understood heroes planting flags. It was a simple, powerful image. The intricacies of collecting anorthosite rock samples or performing seismic experiments were harder to translate into compelling television. The narrative became more academic, less adventurous. Furthermore, the immense strain on the astronauts and their families was a constant reality. They lived under an intense public spotlight, and the long years of training and the life or death nature of their work took a heavy toll. While they were willing to take the risks, the question arose within NASA and the government. For what, exactly? If the primary political goal was met and the public was no longer captivated, was it fair to continue asking these men to risk their lives for what was becoming incremental scientific gain? The human cost, the years of sacrifice, the psychological pressure. These were not line items on a budget, but they were real factors. There was a sense that these men had done their duty, had performed miracles. Perhaps it was time to bring them home, to celebrate their incredible achievements, and to close this chapter before tragedy struck. The decision to end Apollo was not just about machines and money. It was also about the finite endurance and immense sacrifice of the remarkable human beings who made the journey. Let's gently float away from the specific reasons and consider a broader shift in perspective, a change in the very idea of progress itself. The 1960s were a decade of incredible technological optimism. It was a time when anything seemed possible. The Apollo program was the ultimate expression of this belief. If we could put a man on the moon, we could solve any problem. This was the era of the technological fix, the idea that science and engineering held the keys to a better future. The sleek, futuristic designs of the rockets and capsules embodied this forward-looking spirit. The goal was linear and clear. Go further, go faster, conquer the next frontier. It was a vision of progress as a straight line, pointing ever upward, from Earth to the moon, and from the moon to Mars and beyond. However, as the 60s gave way to the 70s, a new consciousness began to emerge. The environmental movement was born. People began to look at the images of Earth from space, that fragile blue marble, and realize the preciousness and isolation of our own planet. The idea of progress began to change. It was no longer just about going outward. It was also about looking inward. It was about sustainability, about understanding and preserving our own world. The focus shifted from conquering new frontiers to solving the problems of the one we already inhabited. This new environmental awareness created a subtle but profound critique of the space program. Some saw it as the ultimate expression of a throwaway culture. We were spending billions to explore a dead rock while our own planet was facing pollution, resource depletion, and ecological crisis. The powerful Saturn V rockets, for all their glory, were single-use machines, incredibly wasteful from an environmental standpoint. This is part of what made the idea of a reusable space shuttle so appealing. It aligned better with this new ethos of conservation and efficiency. So, the end of Apollo can also be seen as part of a larger cultural pivot, a move away from the Cold War era vision of conquest and technological dominance toward a more holistic, Earth-centric view of our place in the universe. The pictures of Earthrise and the blue marble taken by the Apollo astronauts were perhaps the program's most lasting legacy. They were intended as a record of a journey to another world, but they became a powerful symbol for the movement to save our own. The grand adventure to the moon inadvertently taught us the importance of the home we had left behind. Now, let's explore the bureaucratic and organizational realities within NASA itself. An organization of that size is like a giant ship. It has immense momentum, but it can be difficult to turn. During the 1960s, NASA was an organization with a single laser-focused goal: the moon. Every department, every engineer, every dollar was aligned with the Apollo mission. This created an incredible sense of purpose and efficiency. It was a wartime-like mobilization, and it was brilliantly effective. However, once that goal was achieved, the organization faced an existential crisis. What next? A large bureaucracy cannot exist without a mission. It needs projects to justify its budget and its workforce. With the end of the Apollo production line and the cancellation of the final missions, entire divisions of brilliant engineers and technicians were facing layoffs. The vast industrial infrastructure that had built the Saturn rockets and the Apollo modules was about to go idle. NASA needed a new, large-scale project to keep its teams together and to maintain its relevance in a post-moon race world. The Space Shuttle program became that project. It was a challenge of immense complexity, requiring new technologies and materials, science, computer control, and aerodynamics. It was a project that could keep the core of NASA's workforce employed for another decade or more. It gave the agency a new reason to exist. In this light, the decision to pivot from the moon to the shuttle was not just a strategic choice. It was an act of organizational self-preservation. Continuing the Apollo missions with their diminishing returns and waning public support, was becoming a dead end. It was a program from the past. The shuttle, on the other hand, represented the future. It promised a new way of operating in space, and it provided a long-term engineering challenge that the agency could rally around. This internal, bureaucratic pressure is often overlooked. We tend to think of these decisions in grand, strategic terms, but the reality is often more mundane. Organizations need a purpose. They need to secure their budgets for the next fiscal year. The end of Apollo and the birth of the shuttle was a perfect example of this. NASA had to reinvent itself to survive in the new political and economic climate of the 1970s. It traded its glorious past for a pragmatic future, ensuring its own continuation as America's premier space agency. Let's reflect on the very nature of a race. A race has a starting line, a course, and a finish line. The space race was no different. Its starting line was the launch of Sputnik. Its finish line was Neil Armstrong's footprint in the lunar dust. The primary competitor, the Soviet Union, was the driving force behind the entire American effort. The fear of Soviet dominance in space is what opened the national purse strings and galvanized public opinion. Without the Soviets, there would have been no Apollo program, at least not in the accelerated, hyper-funded form it took. The Soviet space program had its own secret plans for a manned lunar mission. They developed a colossal rocket, the N-1, to rival the Saturn V. But their program was plagued by internal rivalries, insufficient funding, and, most critically, catastrophic failures. The N-1 rocket failed on all 4 of its test launches between 1969 and 1972, with one explosion on the launch pad being one of the largest non-nuclear explosions in history. After the success of Apollo 11, the political motivation for the Soviet lunar program evaporated. They quietly canceled it and focused their efforts on a different goal: long-duration space stations like the Salyut and later Mir. They effectively conceded the moon and chose a different path. This had a profound impact on the American program. With a competitor out of the race, who were we racing against? The answer was nobody. The intense existential pressure was gone. The Apollo program transformed from a national security imperative into a scientific and exploratory endeavor. And while science and exploration are noble pursuits, they simply do not command the same level of political urgency or public funding as a direct competition with a geopolitical rival. Imagine a marathon runner who has been training relentlessly, pushing their body to the absolute limit. Then, halfway through the race, they look back and realize their only competitor has dropped out. Do they continue to sprint at a record-breaking pace, or do they slow down, enjoy the scenery, and run at a more sustainable rhythm? The United States, having crossed the finish line first and found itself alone on the track, chose to slow down. The end of the competitive aspect of the space race removed the primary justification for Apollo's massive budget and breakneck schedule. The program had served its political purpose, and the imperative to keep going, to keep pushing, simply faded away into the vacuum of its own success. Let's consider the hardware itself, the magnificent machines that made the journey possible. The Apollo program was built on a specific set of technologies designed for a single purpose: to get to the moon and back. The Saturn V rocket, the command module, the lunar module, they were all wonders of engineering. But they were also single-use technologies. They were the pinnacle of expendable rocketry. Each mission required a brand new, incredibly expensive rocket that was discarded after a single flight. This was not a sustainable model for routine space travel. It was like building a brand new ocean liner for a single transatlantic voyage and then scuttling it upon arrival. While breathtakingly effective for the sprint to the moon, it was an incredibly inefficient and costly way to operate in space over the long term. As we've touched upon, the vision for the future of spaceflight was shifting toward reusability and sustainability. The space shuttle concept was the embodiment of this new philosophy. The idea was to create a vehicle that could fly to space dozens, even 100 times, drastically reducing the cost of each launch. The dream of the shuttle was to make access to space as routine as air travel. Of course, the reality turned out to be far more complex and expensive than originally promised, but the vision was powerful. It represented a technological leap forward, a move toward a more mature and permanent presence in space. Continuing with Apollo would have been a technological dead end. It would have meant continuing to build and throw away massive, expensive rockets for missions with diminishing scientific and political returns. The engineers and visionaries at NASA wanted to build the next thing. They wanted to solve the next set of challenges. Developing the thermal protection system for the shuttle's re-entry, creating the first reusable rocket engines, designing the complex fly-by-wire avionics. These were the new frontiers of engineering. In essence, the Apollo technology, as brilliant as it was, had become a relic of a bygone era, even as it was still flying. It was designed for a sprint, and the future was about endurance. The decision to end Apollo was, in part, a decision to stop investing in a 1960s model of space exploration and to start building the foundation for what was believed to be the model for the 21st century. It was a conscious choice to move on to the next chapter of technological evolution. Let your mind drift back to Earth, and let's consider the powerful currents of media and storytelling. The Apollo program was, in many ways, the greatest television event in history. It was a real-life drama, broadcast live into the homes of millions. NASA understood the power of this new medium. They worked closely with journalists, provided unprecedented access, and trained the astronauts to be public figures. The narrative was simple, heroic, and captivating. America versus the Soviets, man versus the void. Commentators like Walter Cronkite became the trusted storytellers of this epic journey, his avuncular presence guiding the nation through moments of tension and triumph. The grainy images from the moon were more than just data. They were powerful symbols, instantly recognizable and deeply resonant. However, every great story needs an ending. The landing on the moon was the perfect climax. The safe return of the Apollo 13 crew was a chapter of incredible suspense and relief. But what came next? As the missions became more routine and scientific, the story became harder to tell. The drama was gone. The narrative became repetitive. How many times can you tell the story of a successful landing and a moonwalk before the audience loses interest? The media, which had been a powerful ally in building support for the program, began to move on to other stories. The war, politics, social change. The airtime dedicated to the later Apollo missions dwindled. The front page headlines were replaced by smaller articles buried in the inside pages. This lack of media coverage had a direct impact on public perception and political support. If the missions weren't on the nightly news, did they even matter? It created a feedback loop. Lower public interest led to less media coverage, which in turn led to even lower public interest. NASA tried to generate excitement. The introduction of the lunar rover on Apollo 15 added a new element of mobility and exploration. The live color television broadcasts from the lunar surface were a significant upgrade from the black and white images of Apollo 11. But it wasn't enough to recapture the magic of that first step. The story of Apollo had been told. It was a masterpiece, but the final chapter had been written. To maintain public and political interest, NASA needed a new story to tell. The space shuttle and the promise of a permanent home in orbit offered just that. A new plot, new characters, and a new vision for the future. The end of Apollo was also the end of a particular narrative and the beginning of a search for a new one. Let's consider the international landscape beyond the simple rivalry of the Cold War. The Apollo program, while a national American effort, had a profound global impact. The moment of the first landing was one of rare unity, a shared sense of wonder that transcended political divides. The plaque left on the lunar lander read, "We came in peace for all mankind." This was a powerful statement. However, the program was also undeniably a display of American technological and economic supremacy. It was unilateral. America went to the moon alone. As the 1970s began, a new spirit of international cooperation was starting to emerge. The era of détente was beginning, a thawing of relations between the United States and the Soviet Union. The intense, zero-sum competition of the Cold War was giving way to a more nuanced and collaborative approach to global challenges. In this new climate, going it alone in space started to seem old-fashioned, even arrogant. The future, many believed, lay in international partnerships. This shift was perfectly encapsulated by the Apollo-Soyuz test project in 1975. Just 3 years after the last man walked on the moon, an American Apollo capsule docked in orbit with a Soviet Soyuz capsule. American astronauts and Soviet cosmonauts floated into each other's spacecraft, shook hands, shared meals, and conducted joint experiments. The famous handshake in space, broadcast around the world, was a powerful symbol of the end of the space race and the beginning of a new era of cooperation. The space shuttle program was designed with this international dimension in mind. Its large cargo bay could carry satellites and experiments from other nations. The European Space Agency developed the Space Lab module, which flew in the shuttle's bay and allowed European astronauts to conduct research in orbit. The collaborative model was seen as not only politically beneficial, but also financially astute. By sharing the costs and the benefits of space exploration, programs could become more sustainable and ambitious. Continuing the hugely expensive unilateral Apollo program seemed to run counter to this new global spirit. The future was not about one nation planting its flag on another world, but about many nations working together in the shared frontier of space. The end of Apollo, therefore, can also be seen as the end of the era of nationalistic space exploration and the dawn of the international collaborative model that defines spaceflight to this day, with the International Space Station. Let us return for a moment to the moon itself. For all its stark beauty, it is a harsh and unforgiving environment. Imagine the challenges of establishing a permanent presence there. The lunar dust, or regolith, is not like sand on a beach. It is sharp, abrasive, and electrostatically charged. It clings to everything, wearing down seals, clogging mechanisms, and posing a potential health hazard if inhaled. The temperature swings are extreme, from a scorching 260 degrees Fahrenheit in the sunlight to a frigid negative 280 degrees in the dark. The lunar day and night each last for about 14 Earth days, creating immense challenges for power generation and thermal control. And then there is the radiation, with no atmosphere and no global magnetic field to protect it. The lunar surface is constantly bombarded by cosmic rays and solar particles. Any long-term human habitat would require significant shielding to protect its inhabitants from this constant radiation exposure. And finally, there is the simple, crushing reality of gravity. The moon's gravity is only 1/6 that of Earth's. While this makes for spectacular leaps and bounds, launching materials from Earth to the moon is an enormous, energy-intensive undertaking. Every pound of equipment, every drop of water, every bite of food for a lunar base would have to be blasted out of Earth's deep gravity, well at a tremendous cost. While the dream of a moon base was inspiring, the sheer engineering and logistical challenges were staggering. In the early 1970s, the technology to overcome these hurdles in a sustainable way simply did not exist. We had proven we could get there on short, Apollo-style sprint missions. But setting up a permanent outpost was an entirely different order of magnitude in terms of complexity and cost. By contrast, low Earth orbit seemed far more manageable. It was closer, easier to get to, and offered a zero-gravity environment perfect for certain types of research. The decision to focus on the space shuttle and Skylab was also a pragmatic engineering decision. It was a choice to tackle the next logical, achievable step. Building a permanent base in low Earth orbit was seen as a necessary precursor to any future, more ambitious ventures back to the moon or onto Mars. They needed to learn how to live and work in space for long periods first. The moon was simply too far, too difficult, and too expensive for the next step. It was a dream that had to be deferred, placed on a shelf while a more practical foundation was built closer to home. Let's explore the idea of momentum. The Apollo program was like a giant wave, building for nearly a decade. The energy came from the political will of the Kennedy administration and the immense funding allocated by Congress. By the late 1960s, that wave had crested with the landing on the moon. After that, the energy that had propelled it forward began to dissipate. The production lines for the Saturn V rockets and the Apollo spacecraft were a crucial part of this momentum. These were not assembly lines like in a car factory, churning out hundreds of units. Each rocket and capsule was a bespoke, handcrafted masterpiece, requiring a dedicated workforce of highly skilled technicians and engineers. To keep the missions going, you had to keep this production line active. However, once the decision was made not to order more Saturn V's beyond the initial batch, the production line began to shut down. The skilled workers moved on to other projects, like the shuttle, or left the aerospace industry altogether. The specialized tools were put into storage or scrapped. The institutional knowledge began to fade. Restarting that production line years later would have been almost as difficult and expensive as starting from scratch. It was a use it or lose it scenario. This is a key reason why the program came to such a definitive end. It wasn't possible to just pause it for a few years and then pick up where they left off. The industrial and human momentum was lost. The cancellation of Apollo 18, 19, and 20 was the final signal. The hardware for these missions was mostly built. A Saturn V rocket sits on its side to this day at the Johnson Space Center in Houston, a silent testament to a journey that never happened. But once the teams were disbanded and the factories retooled, the wave had truly broken on the shore. To go back to the moon would require building a new wave from scratch, a new rocket, a new capsule, a new political consensus. The end of Apollo wasn't a gradual tapering off. It was a shutting down of a massive, complex machine. And once that machine was turned off, it could not be easily restarted. The momentum that had carried humanity to another world was gone, and it would take decades to even begin to rebuild it. Let's reflect on the nature of exploration itself. Historically, exploration is followed by settlement and commercialization. Columbus's voyages were followed by colonization and the establishment of trade routes. The exploration of the American West was followed by homesteaders, railroads, and towns. The key driver in these cases was economic. There were resources to be exploited, land to be claimed, and wealth to be generated. The moon, however, presented a different proposition. Scientifically, it was a treasure trove. But economically, in the 1970s, it was a barren rock. The collected lunar samples contained valuable minerals, including traces of helium-3, a potential fuel for future fusion reactors. But the cost of mining these resources on the moon and transporting them back to Earth was, and still is, fantastically prohibitive. There was no viable business case for a return to the moon. No company was going to invest billions in lunar mining when the return on investment was centuries away, if it ever came at all. This lack of a commercial driver was a critical missing piece for the long-term sustainability of lunar exploration. Government-funded, prestige-driven projects like Apollo can achieve incredible things, but they are subject to the shifting winds of politics and public opinion. For a presence to be truly permanent, it often needs to be self-sustaining, or at least have a clear economic purpose. Low Earth orbit, by contrast, did have a developing business case. The communications satellite industry was booming. Earth observation data had commercial and military value. There was talk of manufacturing unique materials in zero gravity. The space shuttle was pitched in part as a commercial vehicle, a space truck that could service this burgeoning orbital economy. It promised a return on investment, something Apollo could never do. The decision to abandon the moon was therefore also an economic one. It was a recognition that, without a clear path to commercial viability, a permanent human presence there was simply not sustainable. It was a grand scientific and political venture, but it wasn't a commercial one. And in a world driven by economics, that made all the difference. The dream of lunar cities and mining outposts would have to wait for a time when the economics finally caught up with the imagination. Let us consider the impact of a single powerful voice. After the triumph of Apollo 11, a key figure in the space program, the brilliant rocket scientist Wernher von Braun became a powerful advocate for the next grand objective, a manned mission to Mars. He had dreamed of Mars since his youth, and he saw the moon landing not as an end in itself, but as a crucial stepping stone on the way to the Red Planet. He and his team at NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center developed detailed plans for a Mars mission, leveraging the Saturn V and Apollo technologies. His vision was audacious, calling for a fleet of nuclear-powered spacecraft to carry astronauts on an epic, year-long journey in the 1980s. Von Braun was a charismatic and influential figure, and he lobbied hard for his vision. However, this focus on Mars had an unintended consequence. It made the moon seem small. It framed further lunar exploration as merely a training exercise, a series of dress rehearsals for the main event. This Mars or bust mentality, while inspiring to some, may have inadvertently devalued the prospect of continuing lunar missions in the eyes of politicians and the public. Why spend billions going back to the same old moon when the real prize was Mars? The problem was, the Mars mission was an even more expensive and technologically challenging proposition than the moon base. When President Nixon and his advisors looked at the staggering price tag for von Braun's Mars plan, they rejected it outright. It was simply a political non-starter. But with a grand vision of Mars off the table, and the moon now framed as a mere layover, what was left? The program seemed to lack a compelling, ultimate goal. The Space Shuttle and Skylab were practical and logical next steps, but they lacked the romantic, exploratory allure of a journey to another planet. In a way, the very ambition of the space visionaries like von Braun, by setting the bar so high with Mars, made the more modest and achievable goal of continued lunar exploration seem less appealing. The conversation shifted from "let's keep exploring the moon" to a debate between "let's go to Mars" and "let's focus on Earth orbit." When the Mars option was deemed too expensive, the Earth orbit option won by default. The moon was left behind, caught in the middle, a victim of an ambition that had leapt too far, too fast. Let's visualize the state of technology in the early 1970s. While the Apollo computers were revolutionary for their time, they were primitive by today's standards. The Apollo guidance computer had less processing power than a modern digital watch. It was a marvel of efficient programming, but it was at the absolute limit of its capabilities. Further exploration of the moon, with more complex experiments and longer duration missions, would have required a new generation of avionics and computing. Similarly, robotics was in its infancy. The Soviet Union had some success with its unmanned Lunokhod rovers, but the kind of sophisticated, semi-autonomous robots that we now take for granted on Mars did not exist. The idea of using robots to scout for resources, prepare habitats, or conduct science in advance of human crews was still science fiction. The life support systems were designed for short-duration missions of up to 2 weeks. A permanent moon base would require closed-loop systems that could recycle air and water with near-perfect efficiency. This technology was decades away from being mature. In essence, while we had solved the immense challenge of getting to the moon and back, we had not yet developed the technologies for living off the land. We were visitors, entirely dependent on the supplies we brought with us. The Apollo program was the pinnacle of 1960s technology, but that technology had a built-in ceiling. It could take us there, but it couldn't support us there. The pivot to the space shuttle was, in part, a recognition of this. The shuttle was seen as a platform to develop and test the next generation of technologies in the relatively safe environment of low Earth orbit. It was a place to experiment with advanced robotics, like the Canadarm, and to conduct the long-duration life support experiments that would be necessary for any future deep space missions. In a sense, NASA made a conscious decision to pause its deep space exploration in order to go back to the workshop. They needed to invent a whole new set of tools before they could realistically dream of building anything permanent on the moon or beyond. The end of Apollo was an acknowledgement that the technological toolbox they had so brilliantly assembled for the race to the moon was simply not the right one for the long, slow work of settlement. Let us consider the very definition of NASA. The National Aeronautics and the Space Administration. The first, A, stands for aeronautics. Throughout its history, NASA has always had a dual mission: space exploration and advancing the science of flight within Earth's atmosphere. During the 1960s, the space part of the mission completely overshadowed the aeronautics part. The Apollo program consumed the lion's share of the budget and of public attention. However, the aeronautics research continued in the background, developing new aircraft designs, improving flight safety, and experimenting with hypersonic flight. As the Apollo program wound down, there was a feeling within some parts of the agency and the government that it was time to rebalance the portfolio. The Space Shuttle program was a perfect bridge between these two worlds. It was a spacecraft, yes, but it was also a winged, hypersonic glider. Its development required a massive investment in aeronautics research in areas like thermal materials, flight controls for unpowered landings, and computational fluid dynamics. It was a project that brought the A and the S of NASA back together in a deeply integrated way. This rebalancing was also a political consideration. NASA's research benefits not just space exploration, but also the commercial aviation industry, a major sector of the U.S. economy. By investing in a project like the shuttle, which had clear applications in aeronautics, NASA could demonstrate a more direct and tangible benefit to the nation's economy and technological leadership beyond the inspirational value of space exploration. Continuing with the Apollo program, which was purely a space endeavor, would have continued the imbalance. The pivot to the shuttle was a strategic move to re-engage a core part of the agency's founding mission, to broaden its political support base, and to ensure that its work had a wider range of applications here on Earth. It was a decision to bring the agency's focus a little closer to home, from the vacuum of space to the upper reaches of the atmosphere. Let's imagine the psychological phenomenon known as goal gradient effect. This principle suggests that motivation increases as one gets closer to reaching a goal. The entire Apollo program was a textbook example of this. As the 1960s progressed, and each successful Mercury and Gemini mission brought America one step closer to the moon, the national motivation and commitment intensified. The goal was clear, tangible, and had a deadline. It created a powerful sense of urgency and a purpose. However, the reverse is also true. Once a major goal is achieved, there is often a significant drop in motivation, a sense of, what now? This can be called arrival fallacy, the mistaken belief that reaching a long-held goal will bring lasting satisfaction. After the elation of Apollo 11, the nation experienced a collective version of this. We had reached the summit of the mountain. The view was incredible, but the climb was over. What was the next mountain to climb? As we've seen, Mars was deemed too high, and simply climbing the same mountain again lacked the same appeal. This psychological letdown was a powerful, if intangible, force. It's difficult to maintain a high level of national effort and sacrifice without a compelling, overarching goal. The space shuttle and the Skylab were technologically challenging and scientifically valuable, but they were not a goal in the same way the moon was. They were a process, an infrastructure, a means to an end. But what was that end? For a public accustomed to the simple, dramatic narrative of the race to the moon, the new era of orbital mechanics and long-duration experiments was harder to get excited about. It was more complex, more nuanced, and less heroic. The end of Apollo can be seen as the end of a very specific kind of motivation. The clear, singular, emotionally resonant goal that had powered the nation for a decade was gone. In its place was a more practical, more sustainable, but far less inspiring vision for the future. And without that powerful psychological fuel, the engine of the great lunar adventure simply ran out of steam. Let's explore a less discussed but important factor: the brain drain. The Apollo program attracted the best and brightest minds of a generation. Hundreds of thousands of engineers, scientists, and technicians dedicated their careers to this singular purpose. They were young, brilliant, and motivated by a patriotic and historical sense of mission. They solved countless problems, invented new technologies, and literally wrote the book on space travel as they went along. This concentration of talent was a national asset of immense value. However, as the program began to wind down, this incredible talent pool began to disperse. With the cancellation of the later Apollo missions and the end of the Saturn V production, massive layoffs swept through the aerospace industry. Many of these brilliant individuals who had reached the pinnacle of their careers by sending men to the moon found themselves looking for new jobs. Some transitioned to the space shuttle program, but many others left the space industry entirely. They went on to work in the burgeoning computer industry, in medicine, in energy, and in countless other fields, taking their incredible problem-solving skills with them. While this was a benefit to other sectors of the economy, it represented a significant loss for the future of space exploration. The institutional knowledge, the hands-on experience, the shared culture of excellence that had defined the Apollo era began to fade. This brain drain was a consequence of the program's end, but it also became a reason why it couldn't be easily restarted. The human infrastructure of the program was dismantled just as surely as the physical infrastructure of the launch pads and factories. To go back to the moon would mean not just building a new rocket, but also training a new generation of engineers and mission controllers, and trying to recapture a culture that had been lost to time. The decision to end Apollo was a decision to let this once-in-a-generation team disband, a choice that would have consequences for decades to come. Let's imagine the lunar surface itself, not as a destination, but as a scientific archive. The 6 Apollo landing sites are pristine, untouched by wind or water. The footprints of the astronauts, the tracks of the lunar rovers, the discarded descent stages of the lunar modules, they are preserved in the vacuum, a silent museum of human achievement. While the program ended, the science did not. The instruments left behind by the astronauts, the Apollo Lunar Surface Experiments Package, or ALSEP, continued to function for years after the last crew departed. These solar-powered suites of experiments measured moonquakes, analyzed the solar wind, and took precise measurements of the moon's interior. They continued to send data back to Earth until they were finally switched off in 1977. The data they collected is still being analyzed by scientists today. And the 842 pounds of lunar rocks and soil are perhaps the program's most enduring scientific legacy. They are a gift that keeps on giving. These samples have been carefully preserved at the Johnson Space Center. For decades, new generations of scientists have been able to request tiny portions of these samples to study with new technologies and new analytical techniques that didn't exist in the 1970s. We are still learning new things about the moon, the Earth, and the solar system from these precious rocks. In a way, this scientific bounty provided a justification for pausing the program. We had collected so much data and so many samples that it would take decades to fully understand it all. We had enough material to keep the scientific community busy for a generation. There was a sense that we needed time to digest what we had found before we went back for more. The end of the missions was not the end of the learning. It was the beginning of a long, quiet, and incredibly fruitful period of laboratory science, a period that continues to this day. The decision to stop flying was, in part, a decision to start studying, to move from the phase of collection to the phase of deep analysis. Let us consider the cancellation of the final 3 missions, Apollo 18, 19, and 20, not just as a budgetary cut, but as a symbolic act. Each of these missions had designated landing sites and scientific objectives. Apollo 18 was slated to explore the Schroeder's Valley, a sinuous channel carved by ancient lava flows. Apollo 19 was targeted for the Hyginus Reel, a volcanic region near the lunar equator. Apollo 20 was planned to be a landing in the Copernicus crater, a relatively young and spectacular impact site. These would have been scientifically rich missions, expanding our knowledge of lunar volcanism and impact history. The hardware was largely available. The Saturn V rockets were built. The crews were in training. The decision to cancel them was a clear and unambiguous signal from the Nixon administration and Congress that the era of lunar exploration was over. It was a statement that no matter how scientifically compelling the mission, the political will and financial resources were no longer there. This had a demoralizing effect on NASA and the aerospace community. It felt like quitting before the job was truly finished. But it was also a necessary step in the transition to the next phase, to free up the budget and the personnel for the development of the space shuttle. The old program had to be definitively concluded. There could be no ambiguity. This act of cancellation also had a powerful effect on the public imagination. It cemented the idea that the moon was a place we used to go. It created a sense of a lost golden age, a feeling that we had once been capable of great things but had lost our way. The story of the canceled missions became a kind of modern myth, fueling speculation and conspiracy theories. Why would they build the rockets and then not use them? This sense of an unfinished story, of a journey cut short, is a large part of why the question, why did we stop going to the moon, continues to fascinate us. The cancellation was more than just a logistical decision. It was the moment the dream officially ended, leaving behind a powerful legacy of what if. Let's reflect on the idea of a flagship program. For any large scientific or technical organization like NASA, a flagship program serves as its public face, its primary mission, and its main justification for existence. In the 1960s, Apollo was the ultimate flagship. It was bold, inspiring, and easy for the public to understand. It drove the agency's budget, attracted talent, and gave everything else NASA did a sense of purpose. Every satellite, every probe, every bit of research seemed to be part of this grand lunar quest. By the early 70s, Apollo was an aging flagship. It was still impressive, but it was a product of the past. NASA needed a new flagship for the future, one that reflected the new priorities of sustainability, reusability, and practicality. The space shuttle was designed to be that new flagship. It was sold to the public and to Congress, not just as a vehicle, but as a comprehensive space transportation system. It was pitched as the key to unlocking the economic potential of low Earth orbit. It was the future. An organization can really only have one major flagship program at a time, especially one as expensive and all-consuming as manned spaceflight. It's where the focus of the leadership goes, where the best engineers are assigned, and where the political capital is spent. To fully commit to the shuttle, NASA had to let go of Apollo. It was not possible to sustain both programs simultaneously. The budgets weren't there, and the political attention span was too short. The decision to end the moon landings was therefore also a strategic decision about what NASA would be for the next 20 years. It was a choice to replace the flagship of exploration with a flagship of orbital operations. This was a massive gamble. The shuttle program proved to be far more difficult, expensive, and dangerous than anyone had anticipated. But in the early 70s, it represented a clear and compelling vision for the future, while Apollo, for all its glory, represented a magnificent past. And organizations, especially those built on the promise of the future, must always be looking forward. Let's consider the subtle but important role of interagency rivalry within the U.S. government. NASA was not the only agency competing for a slice of the federal budget. The Department of Defense, for example, had its own space ambitions. The Air Force had long been developing its own concepts for manned military space planes and orbital reconnaissance platforms. During the 1960s, the civilian Apollo program took clear precedence. But as the Vietnam War escalated, the funding priorities began to shift dramatically. The immense cost of the war put a squeeze on all other discretionary spending, including NASA's budget. Furthermore, the Department of Defense saw the potential of the space shuttle for its own purposes. A reusable vehicle that could launch and retrieve military satellites was a very attractive proposition. The Air Force became a key partner and a powerful political advocate for the shuttle program. They influenced its design, insisting on a large cargo bay and a cross-range capability that would allow it to land at military bases after a single orbit. This military support was crucial in getting the shuttle program approved and funded by a skeptical Congress and White House. In this context, the Apollo program, a purely civilian and scientific endeavor, was at a disadvantage. It had no powerful military or defense constituency to advocate for its continuation. Its purpose was seen as inspirational and scientific, which in the hard-nosed world of federal budgets often loses out to the perceived needs of national security. The pivot from Apollo to the shuttle was not just an internal NASA decision. It was also a reflection of the changing power dynamics in Washington. It was a move toward a program that had broader support across different branches of the government, particularly the powerful defense establishment. The moon was a destination for scientists and explorers. Low Earth orbit was a domain of keen interest to generals and intelligence agencies. In the pragmatic political calculus of the 1970s, that made all the difference. Let's take a final, wide-angle view. The end of the Apollo program can be seen not as a failure or a retreat, but as a natural conclusion to a very specific, historically unique project. Apollo was never designed to be a sustainable, long-term program of lunar settlement. It was designed to win a race. It was a political instrument of the Cold War, a demonstration of technological and ideological superiority. And in that, it was spectacularly successful. It achieved its primary goal with the first landing. Every mission after that was, in a political sense, a bonus. It was a product of a unique convergence of factors: a charismatic president setting a bold goal, a fierce geopolitical rivalry providing the motivation, a booming post-war economy providing the resources, and a public captivated by the promise of a new frontier. By the early 1970s, every single one of those factors had changed. The president who set the goal was gone. The race was won. The economy was struggling with war and inflation, and the public's attention had shifted elsewhere. The unique historical window that made Apollo possible had closed. it is perhaps better to think of the Apollo program not as the first chapter in the story of humanity's expansion into the solar system, but as a singular, magnificent, epic poem. It had a clear beginning, a dramatic rising action, a breathtaking climax, and a definitive end. It stands alone, a testament to what humanity can achieve when it is united by a common, audacious purpose. To ask why it ended is, in some ways, like asking why a great symphony has a final note. It ended because its story was complete. The subsequent efforts, Skylab, the shuttle, the International Space Station, were not a continuation of that poem. They were the beginning of a new kind of story, a story written in prose, more practical, more sustainable, and more collaborative. A story that is still being written today, and which, one day, will lead us back to the moon, not for a short visit, but to stay. Let's consider the human desire for the new. Our collective attention is a restless thing, always seeking the next horizon, the next mystery. The moon, for centuries, was the ultimate symbol of the unattainable, the mysterious other. The Apollo program, in its triumph, pierced that mystery. We landed there. We walked on its surface. We brought back its rocks. We showed the world that it was a real, tangible place, a magnificent and desolate place, but a known place. In doing so, we inadvertently transformed it from a symbol of mystery into a destination that had been visited. Once the mystery was gone, the allure began to fade for the general public. The planets, particularly Mars, became the new moon. Mars was the next great unknown. It held the tantalizing possibility of past or even present life. It had weather, polar ice caps, and a tantalizingly familiar, yet alien, landscape. It became the new focus of our exploratory dreams. Robotic missions like the Viking landers in the mid-70s captured the public imagination with the first images from the Martian surface. The focus of science fiction and of NASA's own long-range planning shifted from the moon to Mars. This is a natural cycle of exploration. We are drawn to the things we don't understand. Once we begin to understand a place, our gaze naturally drifts to the next unanswered question over the horizon. The end of Apollo was part of this cycle. The moon was no longer the ultimate frontier in the public mind. Its role had changed. It became a part of our history, a place we had been. The future, the true frontier, seemed to lie elsewhere, in the reddish plains and canyons of Mars, or the swirling clouds of Jupiter, or the icy rings of Saturn. The journey to the moon had paradoxically made the moon itself seem less interesting to a world that craves novelty. We had conquered that peak, and our eyes were already scanning the horizon for the next, more distant summit. Let your mind settle on the simple, powerful concept of a promise. In 1961, President Kennedy made a promise to the American people and to the world. He promised that America should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. This was a very specific, time-bound promise. It was not a promise to build a moon base. It was not a promise to colonize the solar system. It was a promise to perform a single, incredible feat within a specific time frame. And on July 24th, 1969, when the crew of Apollo 11 splashed down safely in the Pacific Ocean, that promise was kept. everything that came after the 5 subsequent lunar landings was, in a sense, an epilogue. They were scientifically valuable and incredible achievements in their own right. But the core promise, the national commitment articulated by Kennedy, was fulfilled. In politics and in public life, fulfilling a promise is a powerful endpoint. Once the goal is met, the justification for the continued extraordinary effort and expense becomes much harder to make. There was no Kennedy Promise Part 2. No subsequent president stood before the nation and made a similarly bold, long-term commitment to lunar exploration. Without that top-level political mandate, the program was running on fumes, on the momentum of the original promise. When that momentum ran out and the political and budgetary wind shifted, there was no foundational commitment to fall back on. The job was done. The promise was kept. The mission, as originally defined, was accomplished. The end of Apollo can be seen as the closing of a contract. The terms had been met, the work was complete, and it was time to move on to new business. This is perhaps the simplest and most direct reason of all. We stopped going to the moon because the specific, historic task we had set for ourselves was, by every measure, complete. Finally, let's drift into the legacy of Apollo and how its own monumental success set an impossibly high bar for whatever came next. The Apollo program was a unique event, a black swan in the history of exploration. It was driven by a convergence of political will, technological genius, and immense resources that is unlikely to ever be repeated in the same way. It produced iconic, transcendent moments that are etched into our collective memory. The Earthrise photograph, the one small step quote, the successful recovery of Apollo 13. These moments were not just news events. They became part of our shared human mythology. Any program that followed was destined to be compared to it, and would likely fall short. The space shuttle, for all its technological marvels, could never be as emotionally resonant as a journey to another world. Flying in circles around the Earth, however useful, simply couldn't compete with the drama of landing on the moon. This shadow of Apollo has loomed over NASA for 50 years. It created a public expectation that space exploration should always be about bold, Kennedy-esque leaps to new frontiers. The slower, more methodical, and more practical work of building infrastructure in orbit, or sending robotic probes to distant planets, often seemed less exciting by comparison. This may be the most profound reason why it feels like we stopped. The end of Apollo marked the end of a certain kind of space exploration, the grand, nationalistic, exploratory sprint. What replaced it was a different kind of space activity, more scientific, more international, more incremental, and more sustainable. But it lacked the singular, unifying, mythic power of the journey to the moon. We didn't truly stop exploring space. We changed the way we did it. But because the new way was so different, so much less dramatic than the old way, it created a lasting, powerful impression that we had lost our nerve, that we had abandoned the frontier. The truth is, the frontier just moved. It moved to low Earth orbit, to the surface of Mars with our robotic rovers, to the outer planets with our long-range probes, and to the very edge of the universe with our space telescopes. The legacy of Apollo is both a source of inspiration and a heavy burden. It showed us what we are capable of, but it also set a standard that has been impossible to meet until perhaps now, as we finally prepare to leave our footprints in the lunar dust once more. So, as our journey through the past comes to a gentle close, the answer to our question becomes clear. We did not stop going to the moon for one simple reason. We stopped because of a perfect storm, a confluence of many powerful currents. The primary political mission, to beat the Soviet Union, was accomplished, and the race was over. The astronomical cost became unsustainable in a nation grappling with war and social issues on the ground. The public, once captivated, grew accustomed to the miracle, and their attention wandered. The science, while still valuable, began to offer diminishing returns for the immense cost of each human mission. A new political vision emerged, favoring the practical, reusable technology of the space shuttle and the scientific potential of a space station in our own backyard. And perhaps most profoundly, the unique historical moment that made Apollo possible, that perfect alignment of purpose, politics, and possibility, simply passed. It was not a failure. It was not a retreat. It was a transition, a conscious decision to close one of the most brilliant chapters in human history and begin a new one. A chapter focused on learning to live and work in space, on international collaboration, on robotic exploration that has taken us to the farthest reaches of our solar system. And now, after 50 years of quiet work, of building on that foundation, a new chapter is beginning. The Artemis program is preparing to take humanity back, to land the first woman and the next man on the lunar surface. This time, not for a brief visit, but to build a sustainable presence, to learn the skills we will need for the next great journey. To Mars, the long pause is ending. The dream is reawakening. Thank you for joining me on this quiet journey tonight. I hope it has brought you some peace and perhaps a new perspective on our place among the stars. As you drift off to sleep, perhaps you can dream of those silent, magnificent landscapes and of the new footprints that will soon join those that have waited so patiently for half a century. What do you think was the most important reason we stopped going to the moon? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this journey, please consider subscribing and liking the video. Sleep well.